Of his civil rights record after a less than vigorous debate performance in which he was hammered by Senator Kamala Harris on his past opposition to mandatory busing for school desegregation. Biden today said he heard and listened to Harris, but touted his lifetime commitment to civil rights, noting legislation he sponsored and his years as vice president under Barack Obama. Also tonight, President Trump has met Russia's Vladimir Putin for the first time since the Mueller report was released, with its damning conclusion of Russian interference in the 2016 election. Asked if he'll tell Russia not to do it again, the president smirked and told Putin, "Don't meddle in the election." The president faces a crucial meeting shortly with China's President Xi. I'll speak with Democratic presidential candidate Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State, and our correspondents and analysts will have full coverage of the day's top stories. Let's begin with CNN senior Washington correspondent Jeff Zeleny. Jeff, after a rough time in last night's Democratic debate, Joe Biden is doing some serious damage control today.
Well, there's no question. Joe Biden is trying to clean up from that debate last evening. He knows the burden is on him to prove that he is the frontrunner in this race. So he traveled to Chicago today, the hometown of former President Barack Obama. He wrapped himself in the glow of President Obama, calling him my president, as he sought to salvage his own candidacy.
Before I start, I'd like to say something about the debate we had last night.
Tonight, Joe Biden is playing cleanup. After a rocky first debate, raised questions about whether he deserves to be the frontrunner in the Democratic presidential race.
I heard and I listened to and I respect Senator Harris. But, you know, we all know that 30 seconds to 60 seconds on a campaign debate exchange can't do justice to a lifetime committed to civil rights.
In a previously scheduled appearance at Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push Coalition meeting in Chicago, the former vice president trying to turn the page over this extraordinary moment with Senator Kamala Harris Thursday night in Miami.
There was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools, and she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me. Do you agree today that you were wrong to oppose busing in America then?
No,
do you agree?
I did not oppose busing in America. What I opposed is busing ordered by the Department of Education.
It was a performance even many admirers charitably described as rusty, with one ally telling CNN he knows he has to do better. After waking up to brutal headlines and tough critiques, Biden is trying to seize command over his long record, which he struggled to do on the debate stage.
I want to be absolutely clear about my record and position on racial justice, including busing. I never, ever opposed voluntary busing.
Campaign, the controversy isn't really about busing, but instead a conversation about the direction of Democrats and whether Biden fits the moment as the party increasingly shifts to the left. The post-debate spotlight would have shined even brighter for Harris if she wasn't still trying to clean up a political mess of her own about whether she supports abolishing private health insurance.
Who here would abolish their private health insurance in favor of a government-run plan?
She and Senator Bernie Sanders were the only candidates to raise their hands. But she now says she misunderstood the question, insisting she was only talking about her personal plan, not those for millions of Americans. It's an issue she's repeatedly struggled to make clear since this moment at a CNN town hall in January.
Let's eliminate all of that. Let's move on.
So Senator Harris spent a lot of the day trying to explain that, as Vice President Biden was trying to explain his civil rights record as well. Well, all of the other candidates also trying to make their case. One thing that has stood out to me from being in Miami for a couple days here, it is a very diverse Democratic field. It is a general, there's certainly an ideological divide, a generational divide here. This race is just getting started. Voters out there we talk to say they're just learning these candidates. So it's more important to take a full measure of Vice President Biden in particular. His advisors are worried and a little bit concerned about the first performance, but they say wait and see what he does going forward. I'm told he'll be doing more campaigning in July. And, of course, the next debate here on CNN at the end of the month.
Yeah, supporters believe he could have done better last night. Sure. There's no doubt about that. Jeff Zeleny, thank you very much. There's more breaking news right now. President Trump is getting ready for a crucial meeting at the G20 summit, but the shockwaves are still spreading after his stunning remarks during earlier talks in Japan with Russia's Vladimir Putin. Let's go live to CNN's chief White House correspondent, Jim Acosta. He's in Osaka, Japan for us at the G20 summit. What's the latest, Jim?
Well, President Trump is just hours away from holding a high-stakes meeting with China's leader Xi Jinping to see if both leaders can figure out a way to end their costly trade war. The president is also expected to hold a news conference later in the day where he is expected to face a nagging question. Why won't he get tough on Vladimir Putin? It was hardly a warning that will send shivers down the spine of Vladimir Putin, as President Trump appeared to jokingly tell the Russian leader to stay out of the 2020 election with a smile on his face. The president's comments at the G20 summit were the latest indication that Mr. Trump is unwilling to accept the U.S. intelligence community conclusion that Moscow interfered in the 2016 election. At their previous meeting in Helsinki last year, the president was siding with Putin.
I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
The president's latest encounter with Putin comes after special counsel Robert Mueller warned that Russia had been caught red-handed.
I will close by reiterating the central allegation of our indictments, that there were multiple, systematic efforts to interfere in our election. And that allegation deserves the attention of every American.
Thank you very much.
Contrast the Trump-Putin warmth with the icy reception the Russian leader found with outgoing British Prime Minister Theresa May, whose spokesperson said in a statement she told Putin that there cannot be a normalization of our bilateral relationship until Russia stops the irresponsible and destabilizing activity that threatens the UK and its allies, including hostile interventions in other countries, disinformation, and cyber attacks. Back in the U.S., former President Jimmy Carter alleged that Russia had essentially handpicked Mr. Trump.
Although not yet quantified, if fully investigated, would show that Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put into office because the Russians interfered on his behalf.
So do you believe President Trump is an illegitimate president?
Based on what I just said, which I can't retract.
The reality is Mr. Trump has never really warned Putin to butt out of U.S. politics, an opportunity he passed up back in 2016.
Why not get tough on Putin and say stay out? Why not say that?
What do I have to get involved with Putin for? I have nothing to do with Putin. I will tell you this. Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press. Let's see if that happens.
The president and Putin shared one other lighthearted moment when Mr. Trump took aim at the media.
You don't have a problem in Russia. We have. You don't have. You might have. We just said that.
But in Putin's Russia, the press is hardly free, as journalists have been imprisoned and even murdered for their coverage of the Kremlin. The president took his jab at the press on the same day he greeted Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, whose government is widely seen as responsible for the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And the president will be meeting with Mohammed bin Salman later on this morning. We'll be watching to see whether or not the president raises with the Crown Prince the case of Jamal Khashoggi. Meanwhile, the financial markets are bracing for the outcome of the president's meeting with China's Xi Jinping later on here at the G20 summit. There are hopes of some kind of ceasefire between the two leaders in their trade war, something we expect the president to discuss further at his news conference later today. And Wolf, it's hard to imagine getting through this news conference without the president being asked about those stunning comments from the former president, Jimmy Carter. Wolf.
Sure, he'll be asked indeed. All right, Jim Acosta in Japan for us. Thank you. Joining us now, the Democratic presidential candidate and Washington State Governor Jay Inslee. Governor, thanks so much for joining us.
You bet.
I want to talk more about your ideas, your candidacy in just a moment. But first, let me get your reaction to what we heard from some of your Democratic rivals last night at that debate. Do you think former Vice President Joe Biden's record on civil rights is fair game?
Well, I do. Look, we've got to have a nominee who is up to the tasks of the current decade. And I think there are legitimate questions. We need to heal this country racially after the division of Donald Trump. I think there are some concerns legitimately raised in that debate. We need someone to stop this rush to war in Iran. And I totally oppose the Iraq war. The vice president supported it. And most importantly, we need a candidate who will have a full mobilization in the United States to defeat the climate crisis. Look, today we got to Miami, the Everglades were on fire. It's 114 degrees in Paris. I have a full-throated call to mobilize the United States to defeat climate crisis, and I have a decision to make it top priority. I don't think the Vice President has the same view. So, yes, we need to have a debate about the current mission statement of the United States in this decade.
One of your Democratic rivals now, Ohio Congressman Tim Ryan, he's actually joined your demand for a debate focusing strictly on climate change, which, of course, is your signature issue. But the Democratic National Committee, at least as far as I know, has promised to stick to its current debate schedule and its current format. Have you heard from the DNC chair, Tom Perez, or anyone else at the DNC about your demands to hold a debate solely on climate change?
Not today, and the party needs to do this. Look, this is a personal passion of mine. I've been working on this for decades. I've written a book about it. I helped form the U.S. Climate Alliance. My dedication to this is unparalleled in the field of candidates. But this is not about one candidate. It's about one planet. And we need to have an adequate discussion of this, which we did not the other night. In 4 hours of debate, the Democratic Party only talked about the existential threat to survival as we know it for about 15 minutes. That does not give America the ability to find out what these candidates say or do not say. Look, there's differences between the candidates. I'm saying we need to get off coal, others are not. I am saying this has to be the top priority of the United States. Others are not. I've called for a mobilization of the United States. Others treat this as just kind of a peripheral thing on the to-do list. So I believe Americans need to suss out where the candidates stand, and we're going to continue this effort.
Let's talk about the meeting that President Trump had with Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit. That's the first meeting that they've had since the release of the Mueller report. As you saw, the president jokingly chided Putin for election interference here in the United States. It's clear he wasn't serious at all about that. What did you make of that moment?
I'm continually stunned by a president who either treats this as a humorous event or absolutely requests the assistance of Russia. Look, not only did he do that before the last election, he did it again 2 weeks ago. He basically said, look, send me stuff. I'll be happy to take a look at it. He continues on this wink and a nod when we are in a mortal situation where a foreign power is attempting to subvert our democracy in clear, unequivocal, and beyond a reasonable doubt terms. This man is a threat to national security. He is a threat to democracy. And I think Jimmy Carter's comments went to the heart of something that is not a peripheral matter. It is a dire threat to who we are as a nation, and it will not stand. And that's one of the reasons I believe that the House needs to move forward at this point with an impeachment inquiry. He's called for it. He's made it inevitable.
Governor Inslee, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, we have some breaking news from the sports world. Just moments ago, the U.S. women's national soccer team defeated France 2-1. Both U.S. goals were scored by Megan Rapinoe, who was criticized by President Trump this week for saying she wouldn't go to the White House to meet with him if the U.S. team were to win the overall tournament. Today's victory puts the U.S. in the World Cup semifinals. Up next, President Trump jokes about Russia's attack on the presidential election, smirking as he tells Vladimir Putin not to do it again. I'll ask former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper about that and more. And police in Utah make an arrest as the search for a missing college student ends with a grim discovery. In his first meeting with Vladimir Putin since the Mueller report came out, President Trump joked about Russia's election attack here in the United States. Joining us now, the former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. He's a CNN national security analyst. General Clapper, the president, he chided in a very joking way the Russian leader. Watch this. He had a smirk and a smile, and he said, don't meddle in the election. Please don't meddle in the election. How do you think Putin a man you studied for a long time in the U.S. intelligence community, reacted to that?
Well, I think first, the president and his supporters will say he was just smoking and joking with Vladimir Putin. And then for people like me that take the Russian threat seriously, this was stunning but not amazing. And I think Putin, for his part, feels as though that attitude, the cavalier attitude about the Russian threat to our fundamental system, gives him license to continue to do what he's been doing, and we can count on it for the election in 2020.
So, based on what you know, why is the president seemingly, in your word, so cavalier about this issue when he meets with Putin?
Well, that's of course the question of the hour, and it has been for some time. The president's ambivalence about the Russian interference, his deference to Putin, among other autocrats, is something of a mystery. He is yet to call him out or dime him out for the profound, broad-gauged and deep interference in our election in 2016.
As you remember, it wasn't that long ago, a few weeks ago, the president told ABC News that he would accept information on his political opponents from foreign governments, even hostile foreign governments like Russia or China. He might or he might not. He might also call the FBI, might not call the FBI. Based on what you saw and based on what we're seeing now at the G20, is the 2020 election season here in the United States open season, fair game?
Oh, absolutely. For not only the Russians, but I think others, having seen the impact of the Russian interference and the divisiveness and polarization that the Russian interference amplified, I'm sure not only Russia will continue to do what they've been doing, but others will as well. And it doesn't bode well when the commander-in-chief refuses to call out for the American public the threat posed by the Russians.
As you saw in Jim Acosta's report, former President Jimmy Carter went so far as to suggest that President Trump's election was illegitimate because of the Russian interference. Do you think that's true?
I have a little different take on that, Wolf. In my book, I do believe that the magnitude of the Russian effort, as recounted in the Mueller report, where they reached via social media platforms alone some 136 Americans, the election was decided on less than 80,000 votes in 3 states, which the Russians targeted. That's not an indictment of people who voted for President Trump. It is an indictment, clearly, of the Russians and perhaps our failure to prevent the magnitude of the attack.
The president also joked with Putin about what the president calls fake news. Let me play the clip. Watch this.
Fake news. You don't have a problem with Russia. We have. You don't have. You might have.
He says we have the problem. Yes, yes, yes. The same. As you know, journalists in Russia, they're either imprisoned. Some have actually been killed because what they're reporting about the Kremlin. How dangerous is it, this kind of rhetoric that we're seeing from the president with a leader like Putin?
Well, it's quite dangerous to characterize our media as the enemy of the people. A free and independent media is one of the hallmarks of our political system. And clearly, I think the control and the oppression of any free media in Russia is something that I think if President Trump had his preference, that's the way it'd be in this country, and that's very dangerous.
Very dangerous indeed. All right, James Clapper. General, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Will, for having me.
Coming up, more on the breaking political, including former Vice President Joe Biden wasting no time in trying to recover from the scolding over racial issues he received from Senator Kamala Harris during last night's Democratic presidential debate. In a speech this afternoon, the former vice president touted his lifetime commitment to civil rights. Let's bring in our experts and discuss Biden's attempt at damage control. Jeff Zeleny, he's got a lot of work ahead of him. All of them have a lot of work ahead of him. But you were there in Miami for both of these presidential debates. Who were the winners and the losers?
After 4 hours and 20 candidates, I think we do know a little bit more than we knew at the beginning of the week. One, I think the winners were, no question, Senator Kamala Harris. She has been, she had a very good beginning of her candidacy in January, and then she's sort of fallen into the recesses a bit. Last night, she came on the stage in an aggressive way, in a strategic way, to get these issues, to introduce herself. She got a lot of biography in there when she was making these confrontations with the former vice president. So I think she did very well. I think the night before, Elizabeth Warren also did well in terms of presenting her plans, her ideas. I think the biggest question mark hanging over all of this is about Joe Biden. Is he the placeholder in this race, or is he the front runner who's a little fragile, if you will? And we don't know the answer to that. One debate won't tell us that, but it told us last night that he is not a strong front runner.
You know, April Ryan is here in a tense moment. Senator Kamala Harris questioned the former vice president on his record on busing, going way back several decades. Let me play part
70s.
of their exchange.
Do you agree today that you were wrong to oppose busing in America then?
No.
Do you agree?
I did not oppose busing in America. What I opposed is busing ordered by the Department of Education. That's what I opposed.
Well,
I
there
did
was
not
a
oppose.
failure of states to integrate public schools in America. I was part of the second class to integrate Berkeley, California public schools almost 2 decades after Brown v. Board of Education.
Because your city council made that decision. It was a
So
local
that's
decision.
where the federal government must step in.
The
That's why
federal
we have the
government must
Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act.
So give us some context here. I know this is a subject, desegregation, busing, close to your heart.
Yeah, it's a lot of black people who grew up in that 70s era had to deal with issues of busing. As a child, my parents opted out of keeping me in public school because they didn't want the residue of hate from white people who were upset about it, about me possibly going to their public school. So they sent me to a Catholic school. So Kamala Harris is not alone in this. There's so many people who have a story. But let's get to the issue of Joe Biden with this. That is a 70s mindset. That is even a mindset even before the 70s. 2019, he has to do something to fix it. He's getting into the weeds as to if it's about the federal government or if it's about the city council or the state. At issue is Joe Biden says that he has a great record. He got into politics, you know, trying to work with civil rights. Civil rights is about integration. The federal government, as he talks about, he didn't want the Department of Education to do busing. The federal government integrated the military. The federal government integrated federal workspaces. The federal government integrated the post office. And if it weren't for the lead of the federal government, other agencies, like I might not even be sitting here talking to you, Wolf Blitzer. So integration is a part of civil rights.
How did you see it last night, Jackie?
You know, it really seemed like Harris had Biden on his heels. And the question is, how is he not prepared for this question? If he wasn't going to get it, maybe he was surprised he got it from Senator Harris. From talking to people in Biden world today, they actually weren't. They knew they assumed that she was going to take him on in some way. But he certainly would have gotten it from the moderators. And, you know, all you need to know is when you're watching him work through it, and then has a candidate ever in your history of hosting debates stopped themselves, said, no, I'm out of time. Yeah. That's unusual.
And she was ready for it with the picture. And not only that, Joe Biden came out with the mayor of Atlanta to say, okay, wait a minute, we were caught off guard, but I'm showing you I've got black support. This is about the fact that Joe Biden still has the largest number of black people supporting him, and Kamala Harris wants that.
Let me get Sean Turner into this. He does have a lifetime commitment, Sean, to civil rights. He was the vice president of the United States under the first black president of the United States. Is he effectively communicating his record?
Well, you know, Wolf, I think he certainly is trying to send a strong message to the Democrat Party that he has a record of advocacy and leadership on civil rights. And I think that's a good thing. But I think the problem that Joe Biden has right now is that he has to understand how to balance talking about what he has done and his long record with what he will do. If you go back and you look at what was said on the stage last night and you look at the kind of target audience of all the people he was on stage with, many of them were talking to this kind of more progressive, left-leaning wing of the Democrat Party, and they were talking about the future because that's what they want to hear. That's what they want to talk about. Joe Biden spent more time talking about his record and what he's done, and again, that's not a bad thing, but the balance is off there. And I think that if he makes that adjustment, I think that last night certainly he was knocked down a few points, and I think we'll probably see that in some of the polling. But if he makes that adjustment, and if he does if he does what he's doing today and specifically goes out and talks to African-American voters, particularly young African-American voters, because I think that he's doing fairly well with those kind of middle-of-the-road, moderate Democrat African-American voters, then he can recover from this.
Okay, guys, stand by. There's a lot more we need to discuss. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. What did you think of the way the president sort of smirked and smiled and had a little friendly warning to Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit in Japan today when he said, don't meddle in the U.S. presidential elections anymore? What did you think of that, the way he handled that?
Yeah, you know, I think it represents kind of the president's new thinking on this. The president has gone from being angry about the suggestion that Russia interfered in the election to just kind of smirking and being dismissive of it. And I think he's that way because he understands that it's virtually impossible to quantify the impact, the effect of Russia's interference. And so I think the president's at a point where he'll just kind of be dismissive of it and won't really care if Russia interferes again. But to be clear, it is a serious and significant national security threat that the president should take seriously. And the former president, I should say, Jimmy Carter, Jeff, he's actually questioning the legitimacy of President Trump's election because of Russian interference on his behalf. Watch this.
There's no doubt that the Russians did interfere in the election, and I think the interference, although not yet quantified, if fully investigated, would show that Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put into office because the Russians interfered on his behalf.
So do you believe President Trump is an illegitimate president?
Based on what I just said, which I can't retract.
It's a pretty stunning statement.
It certainly is. And also from someone, Jimmy Carter, he's actually given the president more leeway than some other Democrats have. On North Korea and other matters, he has given him some support and some backup. So it's an extraordinary, tough statement, but that is at the heart of why many people suspect the president has the relationship he has with Vladimir Putin. He is unable to get his mind around the fact that he may not have actually won the presidency fair and square. Of course, he lost the popular vote. I mean,
yes, he did.
We know that. But that was, we've never heard Jimmy Carter say anything like that I'm not sure he has access to any intelligence information, but based on the public record, that's what he's saying. But the reality is, going forward, you can't do this election over again. The question is, what is going to happen for 2020? What is this government doing to protect the sanctity and security of the next election? And you don't hear much talk about that. Mitch McConnell is trying to block a security bill in the Senate here. So I think that's the value of talking about this now. It's about the future, not the past.
And another very disturbing moment in the meeting between the president and Putin. He commiserated with Putin about what the president calls fake news. Watch this.
You don't have a problem in Russia. We have. You don't have. You might have.
Jackie, how problematic is that?
Problematic is a word, considering they murdered journalists in Russia. It's not only what the president says. I mean, certainly that is disturbing and has ramifications the world over. It's what the president already has or has not done. There still haven't been any ramifications for what happened to murdered journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Saudi Arabia hasn't had any consequences for that.
What do you think about the fact the president is joking with Putin, April, about so-called fake news?
Wolf, as someone who has to fight every day for survival, for asking questions at the White House, it's atrocious.
All right, guys, stick around. There's more news we got to follow. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Happening now, breaking news, firing back. After a bruising Democratic debate, the former vice president is defending his civil rights record after rival Kamala Harris confronted him about his past opposition to mandatory busing to desegregate schools. The tense exchange raised new questions about Biden's strength as the Democratic frontrunner while showcasing Harris and her skill on the debate stage. Also breaking, President Trump is heading into high-stakes talks with China over at the G20 summit after he mocked Russian election interference with Vladimir Putin at his side. The president jokingly asked the Kremlin leader not to meddle in the 2020 vote. He also made a crack about getting rid of journalists, ignoring the fact that some Russian reporters and Putin critics have been found dead. I'll get reaction from Congressman John Garamendi, he's a Democrat, on the Armed Services Committee. And our correspondents and analysts are also standing by. First, let's go to CNN's senior national correspondent, Kyung La. She's in Miami, where the Democrats clashed in their first debate. Kyung, we're told Joe Biden knows he needs to do better after his performance last night. He tried to do that today.
And he hit on that point immediately in his first public comments since the debate, Wolf. He was on the defense, trying to steady the ship with his black voters, where he has seen some of the strongest support in the polls. Tonight, the Democratic frontrunner, Joe Biden, is defending his record on civil rights after an intense exchange during the Thursday night debate.
I respect Senator Harris. But, you know, we all know that 30 seconds to 60 seconds on a campaign debate exchange can't do justice to a lifetime committed to civil rights.
Speaking to the Rainbow Push Coalition, a civil rights organization.
I never, ever opposed voluntary busing.
He's reacting to the debate confrontation with Kamala Harris. She challenged Biden's past when he opposed federal mandatory busing to desegregate schools.
You know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
If we want to have this campaign litigated on who supports civil rights and whether I did or not, I'm happy to do that. I was a public defender. I didn't become a prosecutor.
What is it that turned tonight that made you discuss that?
I just think that on some of these issues, it's that the American public deserves to know how we come at our priorities. There are millions of people in our country who have personal experiences with this, and that voice needs to be on the stage.
A breakout moment fueling a throwback tweet and making headlines. Fundraising jumps, says the Harris campaign, to its third best day.
America does not want to witness a food fight. They want to know how we're going to put food on their table. Yes?
But Harris had a debate stumble of her own.
Who here would abolish their private health insurance in favor of a government-run plan? All right.
After the debate, Harris tried to explain her answer.
So the question was, would you be willing to give up your private insurance?
That's not how it was asked.
For such a plan. And
that's what you heard, right?
Okay, yeah, that's certainly what I heard.
The Medicare for All plan Harris says she supports would effectively eliminate private insurance, with few exceptions, such as for elective surgery not covered by the federal plan. The topic has tripped her before.
I don't know if your insurance company is going to cover this. Let's eliminate all of that. Let's move on. It was in the context of saying, let's get rid of all the bureaucracy. Let's get all of the ways.
Oh, not the insurance companies.
No, that's not what I meant. I know it was interpreted that way. If you watch the tape, I think you'll see that there are...
Now, the debate also challenged Pete Buttigieg. He was asked a question about the officer-involved shooting in his city, South Bend. And the question was on why representation of black police officers has not improved while he was mayor. And Wolf, he said very bluntly, because I couldn't get it done. Wolf.
Kyung live Miami for us. Kyung, thank you. Now to President Trump out on the world stage over at the G20 summit in Japan. He's preparing to go head-to-head with China's leader after meeting with Vladimir Putin and making light of Russian election interference here in the United States. Our chief White House correspondent, Jim Acosta, is on the scene for us in Japan. Jim, this was Mr. Trump's first meeting with Putin since the release of the Mueller report.
That's right, Wolf, and that is not the only high-stakes meeting that the president has here at the G20 summit. He is closing in on a critical meeting with China's leader Xi Jinping later on today here in Osaka, Japan, to see if both leaders can figure out a way to end their costly trade war with one another. The president is also expected to hold a news conference where he's expected to face that nagging question, why won't he get tough on Vladimir Putin?
It was hardly a warning that will send shivers down the spine of Vladimir Putin, as President Trump appeared to jokingly tell the Russian leader to stay out of the 2020 election with a smile on his face. The president's comments at the G20 summit were the latest indication that Mr. Trump is unwilling to accept the U.S. intelligence community conclusion that Moscow interfered in the 2016 election. At their previous meeting in Helsinki last year, the president was siding with Putin.
I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
The president's latest encounter with Putin comes after special counsel Robert Mueller warned that Russia had been caught red-handed.
I will close by reiterating the central allegation of our indictments, that there were multiple, systematic efforts to interfere in our election. And that allegation deserves the attention of every American.
Thank you very much.
Contrast the Trump-Putin warmth with the icy reception the Russian leader found with outgoing British Prime Minister Theresa May, whose spokesperson said in a statement she told Putin that there cannot be a normalization of our bilateral relationship until Russia stops the irresponsible and destabilizing activity that threatens the UK and its allies, including hostile interventions in other countries, disinformation, and cyber attacks. Back in the U.S., former President Jimmy Carter alleged that Russia had essentially handpicked Mr. Trump.
Although not yet quantified, if fully investigated, would show that Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put into office because the Russians interfered on his behalf.
So do you believe President Trump is an illegitimate president?
Based on what I just said, which I can't retract.
The reality is Mr. Trump has never really warned Putin to butt out of U.S. politics, an opportunity he passed up back in 2016.
Why not get tough on Putin and say stay out? Why not say that?
What do I have to get involved with Putin for? I have nothing to do with Putin. I will tell you this. Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press. Let's see if that happens.
The president and Putin shared one other lighthearted moment when Mr. Trump took aim at the media.
You don't have a problem in Russia. We have. You don't have. You might have.
But in Putin's Russia, the press is hardly free, as journalists have been imprisoned and even murdered for their coverage of the Kremlin. The president took his jab at the press on the same day he greeted Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, whose government is widely seen as responsible for the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
And the global financial markets are bracing for the outcome of the president's meeting with China's Xi Jinping later on here at the G20 summit here in Osaka, Japan. There are hopes of some kind of ceasefire between the two leaders in their trade war, something we expect the president to discuss at his news conference later today. But next up for the president, a meeting with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. We'll be watching to see if the president brings up the case of Jamal Khashoggi, and the whole world will be watching that as well. Wolf.
Jim Acosta in Japan for us. Jim, thank you. Joining us now, Democratic Congressman John Garamendi. He's a member of the Armed Services Committee. Congressman, I want your thoughts on the president's trip to the G20 in just a moment. But first, what did you think of last night's Democratic presidential debate, which featured that heated exchange between Senator Kamala Harris and former Vice President Biden?
Well, I was actually flying across the country at that moment, and I just cringed. I said, here goes the beginning of the circular firing squad. We really can't do that. There's so many issues out there. The integration issue goes back to the 70s. I was in the assembly here in California. It was very, very difficult, but we have to press forward. We have to press forward to make sure that every part of our society has access to the education they need, to the jobs that are out there. And so we need to move beyond that. And please, no more circular firing squads for our team. We got a great team out there. They're all very qualified, all very capable. Let's take a deep breath and really deal with the fundamental issue of the president.
But don't you want a serious debate between these Democratic presidential candidates to underscore where they agree and disagree with each other? Don't voters have a right to know that?
I'm quite sure you and other journalists would be more than capable of doing that. We just don't need to do it to each other.
So you think that Senator Kamala Harris was wrong in going after the former vice president like that?
I think the first debate was the kind of debate we ought to have. State of the issues, talk about what you want to do. This second debate, Kamala wasn't the only person that was going after the front runner. I know how that works. I've been a front runner, and I've also been number 2 and 3 in campaigns. I much prefer to talk about the things that I want to do, that I need to do, and let's talk. If it's education and busing, recognize the fact that the federal government spends a whole heck of a lot more money on its nuclear bombs than it does on education. So those are the kind of things we ought to be talking about if we want to be president.
All right, let's move on. What did you make of President Trump today joking with Vladimir Putin about Russian election interference over at the G20 summit?
You think this is a surprise? This is the president of the United States that has continuously, from the very earliest parts of his campaign, kowtowed to Putin, has never held Russia accountable, has never taken the steps that a president must take to protect our democracy. And I was even more concerned, or at least equally concerned, about the way in which he disrespected the fundamental role of the free press in our society, and I think jokingly, or maybe not, said, well, perhaps I could do better if I didn't have a free press.
Former President Jimmy Carter said today that President Trump's election in 2016 was illegitimate, this is Jimmy Carter, because of Russian interference. Do you agree with Jimmy Carter?
I don't agree with the illegitimate part of it. He won. Did he win fair and square? I don't think so. Clearly he had the help of the Russians. Was that collusion? Well, the Mueller report said probably not. But we're going to hear from Mueller, and we're going to get into the details. Whether there's collusion or not, clearly, absolutely, the Russians were helping elect Donald Trump to the presidency. And, okay, he got the necessary electoral votes. He did have 3 million less votes across the nation than Hillary Clinton. But we're not talking about legitimate or not. What we're talking about here is the 2020 election. And I am so disappointed. I am so disappointed in the president not standing up to Putin and say, get out or else, just as Theresa May said.
Congressman John Garamendi, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
All right, just ahead, I'll talk to a former Biden advisor about his debate performance and whether he could turn things around next time. And we're following breaking news in the presidential race tonight. Joe Biden is defending his commitment to civil rights as he tries to recover from a searing attack on his record during the first 2020 Democratic presidential debate. Let's bring in Jake Sullivan, a former national security advisor to Biden, who helped Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama prepare for debates. Jake, thanks very much for coming in.
Happy to be here.
What did you think of Biden's debate performance last night?
Well, the vice president went in, obviously, planning to lay out a case to the American people about how he was going to restore the backbone of this country and unify the country. And he got a lot of opportunities to drive his message on the middle class. And then he had to face what every frontrunner has to face, which is a number of people on stage going after him. But I think at the end of the debate, for all the Sturm und Drang in the media, what most people watching it saw was answer after answer, the vice president sticking to the core message of his campaign.
But didn't he anticipate that issue, school busing, would come up, that someone would raise it, not necessarily Kamala Harris, but someone would raise it? Don't you think he should have had a better response?
Well, here's the thing. I think the vice president really wanted to focus on distinctions or differences between the candidates today, not something that happened, 30 or 40 years ago. So from his perspective, the more time spent on the present and future, the better. And I think he didn't want to get into a deep litigation, as he said in the debate. He didn't really want to be litigating out the question of who's got a commitment to civil rights, since basically all 10 candidates on that stage have a commitment to civil rights that is in an entirely different sport, let alone ballpark, from Donald Trump.
So you helped in the debate preparations for Hillary Clinton, for Barack Obama. How is the former vice president going to bounce back now? There's another debate at the end of July that CNN will be hosting.
So in 2008, there were something like 22 or 24 primary debates between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and the cast of other candidates. In 2016, Bernie Sanders and Hillary debated maybe a dozen times. We have to remember this is a marathon. There are going to be a lot of debates between now and when the ballots are cast. So this, to me, isn't really a question of bouncing back. It's a question of continuing to try to stick to your script and your game plan and turn in performances month after month. When
the president was meeting today with Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit in Japan, he was joking a little bit about Russian interference in the upcoming 2020 election. What did you think of the way the president handled that?
It's interesting. Every time this issue comes up, Donald Trump thinks it casts into doubt his election victory. So his insecurity is now having a direct effect on America's national security. And that's because what he's basically saying to Putin is, you're not going to get any trouble from me if you intervene again in 2020. And I think Putin got the message loud and clear today.
Speaking about that, the former president, Jimmy Carter, he went so far as to suggest that his whole presidency, Trump's presidency, is illegitimate because of Russian interference and the help that he got in winning that election.
I think Congressman Garamendi had it exactly right. Donald Trump got more than 270 electoral votes, so by the Constitution, he's a legitimate president. But
He would not have won the election, in my view, had Russia not interfered. And that's something that we have to take very seriously.
Well, you think Russian interference was decisive in helping him get enough electoral votes?
70,000 votes across 3 states. When you look at the scope and scale of Russian interference laid out in the Mueller report, it's hard for me to argue that it didn't have that kind of impact. If it didn't, then the tens of millions of dollars spent on information and advertising by campaigns every year is totally wasted.
So you think it was about 77,000 votes in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. You think that was the result, at least in part, a decisive result of Russian interference?
A lot of different things could have changed the half that number, 37,000, that would have been required to make Hillary Clinton president. This is certainly a really significant part of that. Not only the hacking and leaking of emails, but the millions of messages sent out on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, and everything else. But the real issue, Wolf, for me, this is not surprising from Donald Trump. We can expect this from him. What's more surprising is that Republicans in the House voted almost unanimously against an election security bill that would protect us from Russian interference in the future. If the president's not going to step up, at least his party could do the job of trying to protect our democracy.
And what did you think of the way the president was joking with Putin today about fake news?
You know very well the sorry, sad, morally repugnant record of the Putin regime when it comes to journalists, killing them, jailing them, disappearing them, exiling them. And for Donald Trump to basically make light of that, he's not just saying, hey, I don't care what you do in Russia. He's making common cause with Vladimir Putin as Putin tries to undermine democratic institutions, including a free press in the West. For an American president to do that, I think that could be the most long-term damaging legacy of this president.
It's a significant development. Jake, thanks very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Just ahead, as Jimmy Carter makes the case that President Trump won illegitimately, how and when will Mr. Trump fire back? And police confirm the breaking news tonight. Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden forced to do some cleanup and defend his civil rights record after a bruising attack by his rival, Senator Kamala Harris, in their first presidential debate. Let's dig deeper with our correspondents and our analysts. Nia, let me play a bit of that exchange that they had last night.
Do you agree today that you were wrong to oppose busing in America then?
No,
do you agree?
I did not oppose busing in America. What I opposed is busing ordered by the Department of Education. That's what I opposed.
Well, there was
not
a failure of states to integrate public schools in America. I was part of the second class to integrate Berkeley, California public schools almost 2 decades after Brown v. Board of Education.
Because your city council made that decision. It was a local decision.
So that's where the federal government must step in. That's why we have the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act.
Nia, how damaging was that to Biden?
We don't know yet. We don't know if this moment for Joe Biden is going to be fleeting or whether it's going to be pivotal in terms of his campaign. It's still early. There's a long way to go before voters make up their minds. Obviously, people are looking at African-American voters because that's the base of Joe Biden's support. And one of the reasons why he's so strong, because he could very well sweep through the South and grab all those delegates because of the affection that black voters feel for him. I spoke to some black voters in South Carolina and got their sense of what they saw last night and whether or not this was changing their minds. And, one of the things they said was leave Joe Biden alone. They feel like this doesn't matter. I mean, this is a kind of a collection of voters. And in terms of Kamala Harris, one of the things that somebody said to me was she loves Kamala Harris, but she doesn't think she could do well with white voters because black voters are obviously looking at white voters and what candidate would appeal mostly to them. So I think when we look at the next polls, I think one of the things to look at is how black voters are still feeling about Joe Biden, if they're still as supportive, and also what white voters are doing. Is this going to turn off any white voters going forward for Joe Biden? We don't know. I think he obviously stumbled. You saw him try to clean it up with his speech in front of the Jesse Jackson Rainbow Coalition in Chicago, and we'll just have to see.
What did that exchange, David Chalian, tell you about Biden's place in this race right now?
It told me that the question mark that has been hanging over the Biden candidacy since its inception still is there. He did not assuage the questions in the political community, among Democratic elected officials, among Democratic operatives, of whether or not Joe Biden is the man for this moment, for this party, to be the standard bearer, to go all the way and take it to Donald Trump. There's a question around that. And what I find so fascinating about Joe Biden's position in this race right now, there's a huge divide between how voters have been responding to Joe Biden and how the political community has been responding to the Biden candidacy. And he did nothing last night, which was his biggest opportunity to date to do so, to assuage the concerns and convince the political class that the voters have this right. Instead, he left them with lingering questions.
You know, David Swerdlick, he tried to clean it up today at the Rainbow Push Coalition in Chicago, as Nia was pointing out. He said, we all know that 30 seconds to 60 seconds on a campaign debate exchange can't do justice to a lifetime commitment to civil rights. What did you make of his effort to clean it up today?
So first of all, Wolf, in that clip you just played, Senator Harris did her effective prosecutor routine against Vice President Biden. All that was missing was for her to say, Your Honor, permission to treat the vice president as a hostile witness. He's got to know in that situation, knowing what people have been discussing the last 2 weeks, that something like that is coming either from Senator Harris or someone else. And to David's point, he's got to show the American people that he's the right man for this moment. You want to be the guy who's going to debate Donald Trump 3 times, but you somehow stumbled in this 30 to 60 second block against Senator Harris, who's never done this before. That's not a good excuse, even if he's right, that you can't get your full civil rights agenda out in 60 seconds.
And Laura Coates, we also saw the former vice president today wrap himself up in the legacy of the Obama presidency.
Well, in his mind, the security blanket. Of course, before he became the vice president of the United States, the crime bill was there. The treatment of Anita Hill was there. His views on busing was all present and relevant at that point in time. I think he thought and was hoping that'd be a clean slate, would start anew with the first African-American president. What he's finding is that was essentially a package deal. Biden and Obama and Biden in that particular order. And he's hoping that he can ride the coattails for as long as he can. But issues like this and questions about his record on race are relevant when you're asking for to be the person to actually sit in the Oval Office at that particular desk.
Ryan, Lizza, what does Biden need to do to make sure that going forward he fixes things up?
I mean, 2 things. One, he needs to familiarize himself a little bit more with the Obama-Biden record on these issues. I mean, I was surprised last night that he didn't just go through the litany. In fact, just on the Obama-Biden administration had a policy, a desegregation policy, because one of the things that's happened in recent decades is a resegregation of a lot of communities and school districts. They had a policy on that, and Biden didn't mention it. He could have been a lot more familiar with his opponent's record on some of these issues, right? Kamala Harris has been criticized for some of the positions and policies she has taken as a prosecutor. He sort of hinted at that when he said, oh, I was a public defender, you were a prosecutor, but he didn't sort of deliver the case. So I think that's one thing. And then the second thing is just to be a little bit more, even in not that dramatic exchange with Kamala Harris, I thought that he was not exactly the most coherent, effective advocate for his own policies and history. At one point, he just stopped. This is a debate where you're only getting a few minutes over the 2 hours. And at one point, he said, oh, my time's up, and stopped speaking, and his voice sort of trailed off. So he just did not seem like he was fully in command of that stage and fully in command of his own record and the record of his opponents.
Everybody stand by. There's more that we need to assess, and we'll do that right after this.
And I watched him for hundreds of hours in the so-called, the situation was not where Wolf Blitzer lives. The real situation is.
We're following the breaking news. We're back with our correspondents and our analysts. And David Chalian, the president, has been in Osaka, Japan at the G20 summit. He met with Vladimir Putin today. First time they're meeting since the Mueller report came out. I want you to listen to this exchange that they had. He smirked, he laughed, he said, yes, of course I will. Don't meddle in the election. Please don't meddle in the election.
So that was the commander-in-chief mocking what is a legitimate, real national security threat that is aimed at undermining the very core of our democracy, our free and fair elections. And what he did was make it into a joke, a toss aside line, and it is not surprising, Wolf. This is not new behavior for Donald Trump, but it is still astonishing to watch the commander-in-chief dismiss a national security threat in public that way.
Is he essentially, David Swerdlick, essentially inviting more Russian and perhaps other interference?
Yeah, Wolf, I think he is, because the message there in that clip you played with him laughing and mocking the idea of Russian interference, he's sending an unambiguous signal to Vladimir Putin and anybody else that he's not going to do anything about Russian interference. So why wouldn't Russia continue to interfere? The president still is hung up on this idea that he doesn't like the narrative that he got help winning the election. And that, among other things, is why he's not going to take these affirmative steps.
And Laura, sitting with Putin, the president also went after what he calls fake news. Listen to this.
Fake news. You don't have a problem in Russia. We have. You don't have. You might have. You still have.
In Russia, journalists are often either imprisoned or even killed.
And the idea that he believes it's the same that's happening right now in the United States of America is very startling and very shocking. Also, the idea of the President of the United States, who, remember the First Amendment and the free press? We honor that actual amendment to the Constitution, that he's making fun of the ability to criticize the government, or at least illuminate issues about the president doing something wrong. This is one of those patterns. I think the president misses the mark every single time. Having the opportunity to be on the world stage, to honor the United States of America and support its core values, and chooses instead to be glib about it. It's remarkable.
Listen to this exchange, Ryan, Liza, that the former president, Jimmy Carter, had today.
There's no doubt that the Russians did interfere in the election, and I think the interference, although not yet quantified, if fully investigated, would show that Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put into office because the Russians interfered on his behalf.
So do you believe President Trump is an illegitimate president?
Based on what I just said, which I can't retract.
Have we ever heard that kind of rhetoric from a former president about a current president, Ryan?
Not that I can recall. And you know, look, Jimmy Carter is someone who has done a great deal of work around the world as an elections monitor, and part of his post-presidency has been a sort of, good housekeeping seal of approval on new democracies and their elections. So, for him to say this, it carries a certain amount of weight. But I think it's our responsibility to point out that what he's saying is, at least my view, is not accurate. There is no evidence, of course, that there was changes in the vote totals. There's a lot of evidence that there was a misinformation campaign, of course, sponsored and paid for by the Russians. And how many votes and how many voters' minds that changed, we'll never know, right? As we all know, only 77,000 votes. If they were flipped in 3 states in the Midwest, you would have a President Clinton, not a President Trump. But he did win the Electoral College, and it's very hard for us to quantify how much the Russian misinformation campaign actually affected voters' minds.
Yeah.
So I feel like he was going a little bit further than most people who have studied this issue have been willing to go.
Yeah, and a little startling to hear it from Jimmy Carter, because he's not really a bomb thrower in this way. But I agree with Ryan. I mean, there's no proof of this. But it does, I think, raise concerns. To David's point, people want this to have some attention, the idea that Russia did undermine our democracy in 2016, and people want this government on high alert going forward.
Everybody stick around. There's more breaking news we're following. A suspect charged with this from Japan. He's at the G20 summit, just waking up over there, already Saturday morning. Look at this. After some very important meetings, including my meeting with President Xi of China, I will be leaving Japan for South Korea with President Moon. While there, if Chairman Kim of North Korea sees this, I would meet with him at the border, DMZ, just to shake his hand and say hello. Very significant overture from President Trump to Chairman Kim Jong-un of North Korea, saying while he's in Seoul, South Korea, that's only about 30 miles from the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, separating North and South Korea. He's willing to go to the DMZ, wants to go to the DMZ, and would be willing to meet with Chairman Kim. He says just to shake his hand and say hello. If that happens, that would be a significant development since they've already had 2 meetings, the last one very unsuccessful in Vietnam. We're going to stay on top of this story. significant development. We'll see if that meeting between Chairman Kim and the president does actually take place at the DMZ. Meanwhile, other news. Our good friend, former CIA and NSA director, retired General Michael Hayden, he's back on CNN later tonight for the first time since suffering a stroke last November. In a new interview, General Hayden is talking